kick off our 50th anniversary celebration. Since 1971, when the idea of Despierta Boricua was conceived, Despierta Boricua has provided students of Puerto Rican heritage with a space to educate, celebrate, and motivate one another for collective appreciation of our shared Puerto Rican ancestry. This celebration will go into tomorrow night via Zoom and is really meant to serve as a space for an appreciation of Despierta Boricua's past, while also serving as a catalyst for Despierta Boricua's future. The 50th anniversary celebration is a 2-day program curated by the Despierta Boricua Planning Committee. Thank you all. And we have right now, thankfully, an audience composed of Yale students, alumni, and members of the Puerto Rican community from across the nation. Our goal is really to celebrate the efforts of the Puerto Rican students at Yale who cultivated their own space within the Yale community and established an important legacy in Yale's history. As such, our event theme, Despierta Boricua, Honoring Our Past, Igniting Our Future, serves to highlight the struggles and successes of Puerto Rican Yalees in driving social, racial, and economic change on campus. Thank you all for being here as we celebrate. As a thank you, 2 lucky attendees will be given 2 copies of War Against All Puerto Ricans by Nelson Antonio Dennis after tonight's events. Before we move on, as a final note, please be courteous to our speakers and have your microphone off during the events, unless we are in a session where audience members are welcome to participate. We'll be recording all sessions tonight except for the memorial service and DB Zoom social. We hope you enjoy.
Despierta Boricua's history is one of emotion, trauma, and celebration. However, most importantly, the life force of our organization has always been interlocked with the collective struggles of other groups working to dismantle white supremacy. It is in this context of community and solidarity that I would like to present a land acknowledgement. Our hope is that you will take this time to reflect on how you can support Indigenous communities. Despierta Boricua acknowledges that Indigenous peoples and nations, including Mohegan, Mashantucket Pequot, Eastern Pequot, Scaticook, Golden Hill Pocasset, Nahantic, and the Quinnipiac and other Algonquin-speaking peoples have stewarded through generations the lands and waterways of what is now the state of Connecticut. We honor and respect the enduring relationship that exists between these peoples and nations and this land. Without further ado, I would like to introduce our first keynote speaker, Honorable Eduardo Padró. Honorable Padró is a founder of Despierta Boricua and received his BA from Yale University in 1975. He received his JD from the New York University School of Law in 1980 and was elected to the New York County Supreme Court in 2002. In 2016, Honorable Padró retired from his work and the stars aligned so that we could have him here tonight to help kick off our event. I'll leave it to you.
Buenas noches. It is truly an honor to be asked to kick off the 50th anniversary celebration of the founding of Despierta Boricua. The leadership of DB has asked that I share a more personal reflection rather than a detailed revisiting of DB's history. So consistent with that request, my presentation will have 3 parts. First, my story, second, my Yale experience, and finally, my legacy. I was born in 1953 and am part of the baby boom generation, the huge number of babies born after World War II, which at every stage of my life, we have been numerically the largest sector of the American population until recently, when we were eclipsed by the millennials. My parents migrated from Puerto Rico during World War I and met in New York City. I was born and raised in El Barrio, more widely known as East Harlem and by others as Spanish Harlem, the first major Puerto Rican community in the States. My mother had an 8th grade education and my father had a high school education. He actually was among the few in that generation that actually got to go to high school. Unfortunately, like many men in his generation, he had a drinking problem that impeded our social mobility. I grew up in the housing projects and attended the local public schools. And then in 1964, Harlem blew up and the private independent schools created scholarships for underprivileged and culturally deprived kids. what poor kids were called back then, and what you might refer to as inner city kids. The following year, upon graduating from 6th grade, thanks to my Jewish guidance counselor, who ultimately becomes my second mother, I received a scholarship to attend the Dalton School, an exclusive private school in Manhattan. During this period, my counselor guided me to a summer camp called Boys Harbor in East Hampton, another transformative institution during my adolescent years. So we were mostly poor kids from East Harlem, Central Harlem, parts of Jersey City, going to hang out and camp in the exclusive Hamptons. After Dalton, I came to Yale, and thereafter attended NYU Law School. During my campaign to become a judge, I often joked about how I was the poor boy with the rich boy's education. Upon graduation, I became an attorney with the Criminal Defense Division of the Legal Aid Society in the Bronx. Note, by this time, the South Bronx had more Puerto Ricans per square block than any place in the world, including San Juan. I then clerked with a judge who, like myself, was a New York Boricua. And at the age of 40, I was sworn in as a judge by New York City's first Black mayor, the late Honorable David N. Dinkins. I served 22 years on the bench, both in the Bronx and in Manhattan, and retired early at age 62, 5 years ago, due to a number of medical issues. So before I was on the Supreme Court in 2002, I got on the bench back in 1993. I married relatively late, became a parent as an old fart, and so rather than having grandchildren that are Gen Z, my children are Gen Z. My daughter's in the first year at Smith, and my son is still in middle school. Many parts of my story are shared by most of the Boricuas who arrived on campus during my 4 years. We were first-generation New Yorkers or stateside Ricans. The bulk of us had grown up in predominantly poor Puerto Rican neighborhoods, which, by the way, most had sizable African-American populations. And most of us had at least one working parent. The New Yorkers probably had an oversized representation from the New York City housing projects, which placed in a historical context, the projects were actually a step up from the tenements. The majority of us were the first ones in our families to attend college or to graduate from college. And ultimately, many of us became the first professionals in our nuclear and often in our extended families. For example, of over a dozen older cousins on both sides of my family, I was the first to earn a college degree, and of course, the first to become a professional. I was 6 years old when we welcomed the year 1960 and turned 17 in 1970. This was the decade in which I came of age. The 60s were a decade of incredible unrest, social justice struggle, and revolution. Much like the pandemic has touched every aspect of your life over the past year, and just like the past 4 years of your life have been impacted by the oversized persona of President Trump and his policies on one side, and the Me Too and Black Lives Matter social movement arguably on the other side, the tumultuous nature of the entire decade of the 60s were an integral part of our very existence. Probably every major urban center in the nation was lit aflame with the 60s riots. The civil rights movement of the South was eclipsed by a militant Black Power movement that was accompanied by Black cultural movements throughout the North and on the coasts. The Puerto Rican communities were in the midst of this explosion of cultural pride, as well as the social and political movements of groups like the Young Lords and Aspira, as well as the struggle in support of bilingual and bicultural education. A similar phenomenon was taking place in Aztlán, the US Southwest, with La Raza and the Brown Berets. Chinatowns were exploding with groups like Iwo Kun. The American Indian Movement, or AIM, was frequently on the front pages of the newspapers as they tackled centuries of oppression. A new feminist movement was taking hold of the country. And in 1969, the Stonewall riots in New York placed the LGBTQ movement front and center. All of this was taking place against a historic anti-war movement, tearing our nation and much too often our families apart. As if all of this was not enough, on the cultural social front, we were witnessing the counterculture of the hippies, free sex and drugs in some communities, and the devastating impact of heroin in too many of our communities. And in 1968, all of our brains were indelibly marked by the assassinations of Dr. King and Bobby Kennedy. Imagine for a minute the killing of George Floyd amplified a couple of times. Meanwhile, on the international front, we witnessed a global explosion of liberation movements and revolutions against colonialism in Africa and Asia, and against neocolonialism in Latin America and the Caribbean. Our heroes were not only Puerto Ricans and Americans, but also international figures. The closest comparison might be to the Arab Spring, the horrendous photos of immigrants dying at sea or as they cross borders, and the resurgence of authoritarian rulers and dictators across the planet. A militant and resurgent Puerto Rican independence movement, though a minority viewpoint, placed Puerto Rico front and center on the international arena as the United Nations committed to reviewing on an annual basis Puerto Rico's colonial status. No matter what your personal politics, the tumultuous state of affairs were unavoidable. And here we were, the first large generation of US-born and or raised Puerto Ricans, children of mostly working class parents with limited academic education, trying to figure out who were we in this picture? A picture further complicated by a nation that perceived of itself as white or Black and nothing in between. It was against this backdrop of turmoil that I arrived on campus in the fall of 1971. Within the very first 2 weeks of being on campus, I am at an ice cream shop on Chapel near Old Campus when I run into Manuel del Valle, who many of you know and who's on Zoom with us today. Earlier that year, Manuel had given a group of us a tour of Princeton, and he was now a first-year Yale law student. Manuel, who was in his early 20s, was a seasoned veteran of organizing on campus. He had been trained in the Aspira process while in high school and had already organized at Wesleyan and Princeton. Little did I realize how much that encounter would alter the course of my life. We hit the ground running and were quickly joined by Cruz Ramos, another freshman from the Bronx, Hector Medina, a junior, and our first chair, who was from the Lower East Side, and Gilberto Casellas, a sophomore from Tampa, who I know is also on with us tonight. We initially formed Boricuas Unidos in 1971, believing we were one people and that we had to work together. So we reached out to the leadership of the informal grouping of islanders. Unfortunately, though we all perceived ourselves as Puerto Ricans, we really reflected two different worlds. The islanders were born and raised, of course, on the island. They came exclusively from the island's top private schools and represented the island's elite and professional class. We were raised in the urban ghettos. Our parents were working class, often with limited education. And while the islanders were almost all white and well off, we were almost all poor and perceived ourselves as non-white. The effort dissolved in disputes over tactics and strategies having to do with Yale's admissions process, and ultimately about the very core of our raison d'etre. Upon splitting with the islanders, I recommended the name Despierta Boricua. The name is rooted in the slogan, Despierta Boricua, defiende lo tuyo, which we New Yorkers identified with activists like the Young Lords. The chant was a call to action, which actually originated with the island's independence movement. We were driven by a need to be politically active, to be a voice on behalf of our people. While our own success was important, we understood clearly that we were part of a much larger community that had struggled to create opportunities for us, and that we had a moral responsibility to give back. So not only did we organize on campus, but many of us also did a lot of work in the local Puerto Rican community. As a young, driven, and committed group, we achieved a remarkable amount of successes. Excuse me. By my senior year, we saw our numbers grow from 5 known stateside Boricuas to about 50. We had created the Puerto Rican Orientation Program, known as PROP, as a pilot program, which then expanded to include all students of color, and which was renamed the Pre-Registration Orientation Program, and which has now evolved into Cultural Connections. By the way, it was so cool to read this history on the Yale University website. Along with PROP came the Floating Counselors, another pilot program, which supplemented the freshman counseling program. Once again, the program expanded to include all students of color and eventually became known as the Ethnic Freshman Counselors. If I'm correct, this program has since been eliminated. Another accomplishment was that, if my memory serves me correct, we were the only group on campus to meet annually with Kingman Brewster, Yale's president. And though we conceived the idea of a Puerto Rican Cultural Center, we refer to it as La Casa Boricua, La Casa Cultural Julia de Burgos came to fruition after I left through the hard work of the leadership that followed. I should note that when we first organized, Manuel reached out to his contacts at other Ivies and Ivy-like colleges where Puerto Rican students had organized before us. And these students provided their materials, which we adapted to our needs at Yale. 4 to 5 years later, we were the only Puerto Rican group on any Ivy campus meeting annually with the president of the college and with a standalone Boricua Cultural Center on campus. It was a period of tremendous spirit and growth. We formed lifelong friendships that endure 5 decades later. Till this day, even when we don't see each other for years, I dare say that a deep love and appreciation survives across time and space. The bonds built between us were often stronger than those we had with our biological siblings. To speak of a Despierta Boricua family is not hype, for family truly describes so many of our relationships. And before I continue, I need to digress just for a minute and highlight that for me and many in my generation, our ties to the African-American students were an integral part of our Yale experience. Though I perceived myself as a Boricua and not as an African-American, during our freshman year, Cruz and I, Cruz was the other freshman, we sat at the Black table in Commons. We became members of BSAY. During our sophomore year, Cruz and I lived in the Black entryway of Branford, underneath the Harkness Tower, and ate our meals at the Black table in Branford through our junior year. And during the first 3 years at Yale, my roommate was Oswald, who was originally from St. Thomas and who had grown up with me in East Harlem. And Hector, the junior in our first chair, by the way, lived in the Black entryway in the Silliman Annex. Needless to say, neither the Islanders nor the Chicanos were very fond of our identifying with the Black students. As we gathered this weekend to celebrate the many achievements, I need to be honest and share that not everything was great and wonderful. This level of activity often came at a sacrifice to our grades. Some of us did not get into our dream professional or graduate schools because of the less than stellar academics. And by the way, as a side note, one of the Islanders that graduated with me was the valedictorian with a 4.0 GPA, a source of pride for us even if we weren't relating to each other. There were those that eventually dropped out and graduated from other colleges. We were young, but yet we thought we knew it all. We made demands of ourselves and each other that were excessive. We were often dogmatic in our political views and stances, and often alienated others, and at times, even each other. Over time, I have conveyed my own share of mea culpas. There was an intensity to our existence that just did not let up. And by the way, it was not just us. This was really a national phenomenon with our generation. The isms of our community were alive and well in DB. We were not immune from the racism, sexism, homophobia, classism, and narrow nationalism that pervaded our culture, our communities, and tragically, so many of our families. To this day, I still recall clearly looking out of my window in Welch Hall during my freshman year, looking out on a quiet, snow-filled New Haven Green, feeling the loneliness and questioning, what was I doing? Trust me, there were repeated moments of questioning whether I should even be at Yale. I and many of us were also struggling with the crises of our nuclear or extended families back home. I recall the bus ride to New Haven when I cried the entire trip because my family was going to give up my foster brother to adoption, knowing that if I left Yale, I could prevent it. Or the stress of whether I should return home to stand by my mother as she finally entertained the idea of whether to divorce my dad, or just to help her deal with my older brother's heroin abuse. And I dare say that these few examples pale by comparison with the issues others in our group had to confront. Over the decades, I have often asked myself whether if I had to do it again, would I go to Yale? And if yes, would I have participated in organizing? The answer has always been a resounding yes to both parts of the question. But every time that yes has been followed by a big but. But I would do many things differently. I want to close with a request for a quick reflection on how do I see my legacy, or what do I want my legacy to be. The fact that we are gathered here today, almost 50 years later, with Despierta Boricua still active, is in and of itself a testament to a living legacy. A legacy I cannot claim as my own, but more accurately, as the legacy of 5 initial founders, as well as, and I need to be perfectly clear, the legacy of generations of DB student leaders, many of whom are the alum on Zoom with us tonight, who committed to the organization and in the process made their own contributions, as well as their own sacrifices. For me, there's also an important emotional, if not spiritual, component to the story, a feeling difficult to describe, but which runs deep into my soul, a combination of satisfaction, pride, joy, accomplishment, meaning, and purpose. And this feeling is complemented by another emotion of being truly inspired and touched as I watch a new cadre of young leaders move the organization forward into yet another decade. Were we living in an ideal universe, by now the United States, Puerto Rico, and all the nations of the planet would have evolved to a point of equality and equity that would obviate the need for Despierta Boricua to have as a core value the struggle for social justice. But living in a world of growing economic disparity, both here and abroad, of an increased existential threat created by climate change, and the resurgence of dark forces, which have emboldened both here and abroad, the isms we have fought against for most of our lives, and which threaten some of our most basic freedoms that we have struggled for, and which at times we might have thought we could take for granted. I truly hope that DB will continue to be true to its four-part mission. One, of supporting Puerto Rican and other students of color. Two, of promoting cultural pride and promoting knowledge about Puerto Rico and Puerto Ricans. Three, continue to take up the social justice issues of today. And four, engaging in some way with the local Puerto Rican or larger communities of color or impoverished communities in New Haven. I wish to leave you with one final thought. When I was in college, I saw myself as a voice for my community, and to some extent, a voice for other communities of color and poor people. For the past quarter of a century, America has undergone dramatic changes in its demographics. For example, in this new America, among the youngest elementary school children, all the children of color combined now outnumber children of purely European descent. We who are now second, third, and even fourth generation have every right to claim this nation as our own, no longer foreigners in a strange land. And important as it is that we continue to be a voice for our community, I sincerely hope that we internalize that we can and we must speak to the future of the American nation. And as we do so, it is my sincere hope that we shall not shy away from partnering with our extended family on the island and supporting the struggles of our sisters and brothers en nuestra querida Isla del Encanto y de nuestros antecesores. I look forward to an expanded intergenerational dialogue in our ever-growing Despierta Boricua family, as long as the good Lord allows me to be on this planet. Muchas gracias y buenas noches.
Hola familia, thank you Honorable Padró for that moving and inspiring address. It truly speaks to the sense of community that exists within DB today, as is evidenced by seeing all of you joining us tonight as we kick off our 50th anniversary celebration. We will not be recording the following portion of our night as we move into the memorial service. If you're unable to join us for the memorial service,